All right, good afternoon. It's always fun to talk right after lunch. Man, everybody's they had their lunch. This is like midday, second day, but it could be like midday, fourth day for some of you. How's it going so far? Do you think the summit's delivering what you hoped it did? I'm glad to hear that. Some? A little bit? Kind of? Okay. Hopefully we can deliver today what you're hoping for today. So I'm Bob Ward from Microsoft. Thanks for coming this afternoon to learn about virtual machines. Before I tell you why it says Reimagined, I have a little story behind that. I have to introduce all the experts in this talk, right? The super experts. I'm not the super expert. They just kind of brought me along. I know something about SQL. So first of all, I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we also have a special guest as well. So Shreya, tell everybody what you do.
Hi, my name is Shreya Verma. I am a program manager in Azure SQL team.
Oh, you do more than that. You're selling yourself short, man. So, by the way, if you have the book, take a look at the chapter on graph database, because Shreya is called out on there. Shreya is one that actually started that project at Microsoft, so there's a little bit of history behind graph. Now you work on Azure SQL, right? That's one of your focuses, right? So who else do we have?
And I'm Matthew Burrows. I do marketing for SQL Server on Azure virtual machines. Thanks for coming out today.
I'm so glad Matt's here, because all the questions are going to go to Matt at the end of this talk, right?
All the technical questions.
Perfect. Yeah. And by the way, at Microsoft, we don't mess around, man. When we actually want to get your feedback, we bring developers that actually write this stuff. So Dinesh, raise your hand. Stand up, raise your hand, Dinesh. So seriously, we're going to have I'm not making this up, and Dinesh doesn't even know this. We have a slide on here where we're going to talk about part of the functionality we're planning. Dinesh literally came today to hear your feedback. So did you know you're going to help design part of the future of what we're doing? That's what we're doing today. That's kind of cool. Dinesh, did you know we were going to do that? He didn't know. So here we go. We'll cover that a little bit later. So hey, let me tell you a little bit about why we call this Reimagined, go over a couple of particulars with you about what we're doing today. So we do want to make it conversational. We don't really have it's kind of a flat room, right? I love these rooms, because instead of it being one of those halls where I can't see somebody in the back, we want you to ask questions to us in the middle of this conversation. Now, if it gets like way too much in questions and we can't cover all the content we think you need to hear, we might defer it till the end. There's going to be some questions that kind of deal a little bit with licensing and some things we're doing in that space, and I'd love you to address those with Matt at the end of the talk. So I might cover those a little bit in a few slides, and we'll want to reserve those at the end and let Matt address those. That's why we brought Matt here today, right? So with that in mind, one other thing about a lot of people ask is like, where's this deck? I didn't see this on the past site. We wanted to make sure you gave the latest content of everything we've announced this week and so forth. So we've been working on this literally this morning to get this ready. You ever heard of this site, this guy named Bob Ward? aka.ms/BobWardMS. Pretty easy to remember, right? I promise you, we will have this deck ready to go after the event. I'll put it up on that site where all the other past decks that I do, so you'll have access to everything you're seeing here today. Yeah. So I was talking to Shreya Tokus, other program manager in this space. She's at Ignite doing the same type of a talk. And I don't know, it's about a couple of months ago or so, and we were talking about working together on this on Azure Virtual Machine. I've actually spent some time in VM in CSS back in the days when we first launched this. And I said, yeah, I'd love to get back involved and talk to you and talk to customers about it. And we were talking through the titles, and Shreya and Mene were explaining what we're going to talk about. And I'm like, wow, okay, that's new, and that's new, and that's new, and that's new, and that's new. And I'm like, so you guys have kind of reimagined virtual machines for customers, right? And Shreya was like, hey, that's a pretty good title. Let's use that. So that's why we call it SQL Server Virtual Machines Reimagined. It's not because of the fact that we don't think it's any good or it used to not be good. It's that we've actually added a lot of functionality to show you we really care about you running workloads here and made investments we think that matter based on the feedback you've done. So that's really kind of why we're calling it Reimagined. And I hope what you're going to get out of this is a lot of information about, there's a few reminders. Hey, reminder a little bit about if you run in SQL this way to perform right, you need to do these things. But mostly you're going to see a lot of new stuff that's really going to help you consider a virtual machine as a great place to run a SQL Server workload. So one thing that is at the end of the deck, and I always forget to do this, Shreya, we'll both forget this, is feedback. Yeah. That's like at the end of the deck, right? The session evaluations, I'm telling you right now, I promise you, when you do feedback in this session, the three of us will get together and look at this and say, hey, what did everybody think about this? Yeah. What do you think about the service? What do you think about our talk? And we really do use that to improve what's going on. So whether you think it's a great session, not a great session, a really good session, which is what you're all going to say, put something in there as a comment. The Cowboys are great, or I really liked what I heard today, or liked the way they presented the talk. So please make sure you do that. With that being said, what I'd like to do is remind you about how to contact us afterwards, because you're going to get done with this. You're going to ask us questions. You may ask Matt a question at the end. You may get Dinesh, who didn't really know he was going to get all these questions here today. And you're like, oh, I forgot something, and they're gone from the event. So instead of us giving your emails, there's a team email, right,
Yeah.
Shreya?
Yes.
This is a really amazing thing. This is a team mail. Remind me, who all is listening to this email here?
Matt is, I am, Aminé is, other engineers from the team are, probably Dinesh is too.
Yeah. How would you like to get direct feedback into what's going on in this space to a team of people without worrying about who to contact? And that's what this alias is all about. So stop and take a photo of that, and we can also put that back up near the end of the talk. Yeah. With that said in mind, I'd like Shreya to kind of take over and walk you through the agenda of what we're going to do today, and then talk about something pretty new, exciting that you're going to see called the SQL Server Resource Provider. Shreya, let me let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Bob. So here's a quick agenda. We'll talk about SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machines today, and we'll go over the new resource provider, SQL Virtual Machine Resource Provider. Then we'll talk a bit about performance, how you can monitor performance, how you can tweak performance, what are the best practices. Bob will go over that. We'll talk about high availability, security, and then backup in SQL VMs. And like Bob mentioned, please feel free to ask questions in between, and we'll be happy to answer. All right, so these are the 5 reasons why you should pick running SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine. So first thing, if you are running SQL Server 2008 or SQL Server 2008 R2, you get free extended support for SQL Server 2008 or R2 images on Azure Virtual Machines. If you are running that on-prem today, and if you have signed up with us for extended security updates, you are paying for that and getting those updates on your setup. But if you migrate to Azure Virtual Machines, they are free for you. Then you get automatic security updates in virtual machines for your installations, SQL Server installations, security patches. These are critical updates, Windows critical updates and SQL Server critical updates that you get automatically on your virtual machines. You have a pre-configured cloud backup with the Azure Backup Service. That gives you point-in-time restore, long-time retention for up to years, multiple years, and it's pretty good service. We'll talk about that later. This is the only cloud which gives you developer edition, pre-configured developer edition with enterprise-level feature parity. On other clouds, you get developer edition, but we have a pre-configured image for you with enterprise-level feature parity. We recommend that you use it for testing purposes before you migrate your production workload to Azure Virtual Machines. And this is the most compliant cloud, as in we have most number of global industry and national security and compliance certifications. So if you are looking for any specific compliance certificate, it's more likely that we have it already, and you don't have to go anywhere else for that. Having that said, now I am going to talk about SQL Vm Resource Provider, which is new. SQL Vm Resource Provider is a management service that you get on your virtual machines, SQL virtual machines, which let you automate a lot of tasks that you would run manually otherwise on your virtual machine. And it has a comprehensive feature set. Like I mentioned, it gives you automated backup, automated security, automated patching, and some automation for failover setup, AG setup. If you have resource provider, you can leverage Azure SQL, our new dashboard view, which lets you manage all your SQL resources, your SQL databases, your virtual machines, your managed instance at one place. You can monitor, you can configure, you can see the configuration. You get access to that dashboard through resource provider. And it also gives you simple license conversions or addition upgrades. So if you are registered with the resource provider, you can switch between pay-as-you-go to AHub licensing or AHub to pay-as-you-go. If, let's say, you are running today AHub with AHub license and you want to save some costs and you want to pay only when you are using your VM, you can switch to pay-as-you-go licensing just by going to the portal and click off a button. Or if you want to go from pay-as-you-go to AHub, bring your on-prem license to cloud and switch to AHub, you can do that using the resource provider.
Since most of us have a hybrid environment, will that work on our on-prem servers too, that are VM, that are SQL servers?
Sorry, I didn't get that question.
Since most of us have hybrid environments, can it work on our on-prem servers also, the dashboard?
So this works on your Azure resources. So it has to be a VM or a database or a managed instance in Azure.
Okay.
And then you will get access to all those resources here.
Put that on the roadmap to be able to
Point
do
noted.
your on-prem.
Point noted.
Well, I think that's a good point about Azure Arc. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, Shreya, but
Real quick, I would make the comment that you saw the promise of Azure Arc that we talked about at Ignite here at this conference. And if you think about what we're doing there, I'm not suggesting this is just going to show up in Azure Arc, but that's kind of the promise. What we talked about Azure Arc is bringing these kinds of things down to that kind of type environment.
Right.
Yeah. Especially for that hybrid scenario you just talked about.
yeah, I think we're all really excited about Azure Arc. You saw that led Satya's keynote Monday morning at Ignite in terms of bringing patching, manageability, et cetera, to your on-premises SQL environments. So.
All right, thank you. All right, so who is eligible for SQL VM Resource Provider? So if you are using our marketplace images to install your SQL Server, you get it by default. You don't have to do anything. It's available to you, and that's our recommended approach to get the resource provider. But if you were to self-install, as in you have a media, SQL Server media lying around, and you want to bring that to Azure on a VM, then you don't get resource provider by default. What we recommend is you go ahead and register with the SQL Server resource provider, VM resource provider, and get access to all the manageability features that we are adding to it. And there are two ways to get a resource provider. There's a lightweight version of it, and there's a full version of it. With the lightweight version, you get the license flexibility and addition flexibility, but you don't get other automated backup and patching features, other manageability features. With the full version, you get all of it. You get the license flexibility, you get the manageability features, you get everything with that. So we recommend that you have full version, but some people, full version requires an agent to be installed there, and it requires a SQL Server restart. So for some people, that does not work, and then they go for a lightweight version. And how do you register with Sql Vmrp? It's really simple. You first register your subscription to be able to download Sql Vmrp on the virtual machines that you are going to run this on. And then once you have added your subscription with the SQL Virtual Machine Resource Provider, then you go ahead and register each VM individually, or there is a new bulk API which will let you register all the VMs in your subscription or all the VMs in your resource group, or you can give a list of VMs and it will register those VMs with the SQL Vmrp. And for registration, it just needs the VM name and the resource group name, location, and license type as input for registration. With that, I'll switch over to a demo here of SQL Vmrp. And what I'm going to show here is that I have a VM which does not have SQL VM Resource Provider installed on it. It's a SQL virtual machine, but it's a virtual machine, but it has SQL Server running on it. And if I come to the portal here, in my overview tab, I don't see anything about SQL Server running on this VM here. It tells me the computer name, it tells me the Windows version, it tells me the size of this VM, but it doesn't tell me anything about my SQL Server running on this VM. Even if I go to configuration tab here, it gives me different configuration options for the VM, but it does not give me any configuration options for my SQL Server. So I cannot really manage my SQL Server from here, from this page. So what customers can do is they can register with the SQL VM Resource Provider. And here's the command how you can register to the SQL VM Resource Provider. You can create a new resource, which is SQL Virtual Machine. You can download that on the VM. And then you provide the name of the VM, resource group, location, and you just, in the properties, you just say that I want a lightweight version of it or full version of it. And this one is lightweight version. And pay as you go, because I'm going to pay as I use my VM, the license type. I am not bringing any license from on-prem right now. So these are the properties that I have to provide as input. And once I have given that, I can go here, and this is my VM, which has the lightweight RP installed on it, registered on it. And when I come here to this resource on Azure portal, which is a SQL Virtual Machine Resource type, I see that it shows me the version of SQL Server that it is running. It shows me the edition of SQL Server that it is running, and along with the Windows OS and virtual machine size details. And then it also shows me that my license type is pay-as-you-go. If it was a hub, it would have shown me here. Now, along with all of this information, it gives me a configure tab here, which lets me change my license model or my edition from here. Now, right now I'm pay-as-you-go. If I go and click on Azure Hybrid Benefit and I confirm, and I can click apply, and it will convert my license from pay-as-you-go to Azure Hybrid Benefit. And then I can just use my on-prem license or SA, software assurance, for this VM. And I can also change my edition type from standard to enterprise or any other edition. But before doing that from here, this actually takes care of changing my billing for my VM for this edition type. Changing the actual SQL Server edition on the VM, for that I have to go there and change the edition on SQL Server first. Once I've done that, I can come back here to the portal and change the edition type here, and this will reflect into my billing also. So,
The question?
yes?
Downgrade from enterprise to standard is allowed?
The question is downgrade from enterprise to standard, is that allowed? Yes, that is allowed, but like I mentioned, you have to go to the machine first, downgrade, then come here and change your license type.
There's another
Yes.
question back there.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I see. So the question is from Enterprise Edition or Azure Hybrid Benefit to pay-as-you-go? Yes, that's allowed.
A core base is more for Azure SQL Database, right?
Right.
Not for Azure VM.
Yeah. So you're saying you want to go from enterprise to core base licensing?
Oh,
as
sorry,
in-
core base licensing for your SQL license. I thought you meant like our vCore.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. Can you use the microphone so we are clear about your question? We want to make sure we answer your question. So.
Yeah. So I have a SQL Server that's enterprise license based
Right.
on the hybrid license agreement, but I probably need to convert to a core based so I can utilize all the CPUs. Does this resource manager allow that kind of convert? Change a product key, something like that?
So I'm not sure if this is the right answer, but you can configure a VM with different cores, vCores, in your VM. And if you have the license for, let's say, 12 cores, then you can create a VM with that many cores and use that license. Is that what you're looking for? No?
Okay,
Something let's take it offline.
Before you leave, though, we'll make sure before you leave today we know exactly your answer to your question.
Yeah.
So.
Is that related, like, for 2008, you had a processor license, right? And then 2012, you converted to a core license.
Right, but I'm not sure I don't understand how that applies to Azure Hybrid Benefit here.
Right.
But I mean, we'll address it after the talk for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is two versions for the enterprise edition. Enterprise edition, less than 20 cores. And
There's a Cal edition and a Core edition. I understand that, but I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about. But hey, let's make sure we'll get an answer for you. But
Yeah.
let's okay.
Okay. So moving on. Yeah, so this gives you license flexibility benefits and edition upgrade benefits here, but other things like security, automated patching, and automated backups, those are not available to you in lightweight mode. And these all other features are available in full mode of Sql Vmrp. And what I can do is, if I come here back to the overview page, here we show you a small banner here saying that in lightweight RP you get only few features that are available to you. And if you click here, you can upgrade the VM to full mode from here. And what this does is it actually registers full mode on the VM. It restarts the SQL Server running on that VM. So be mindful of doing that if you're upgrading to full mode. And this will actually upgrade this to full mode. So now it will take a couple of minutes to do that. And I have a VM here, which is already registered with full mode. As you can see here, that we can see the SQL Server version, standard, like all the other information that we saw there with the lightweight mode. And when you come to the Configure tab, this will actually let you change your license and edition type. And this also lets you configure your storage on your VM. So it will let you configure data drive, log drive, add data drives or log drives to existing data and log drive. It will let you configure a TempDB on the local SSD if you want to. So different configuration options. We create a storage pool out of all of those drives that you have configured, and we allocate that to the VM. And on the security tab, it will let you set up some basic connectivity settings here. And it also lets you integrate with Azure Key Vault. This is a standard edition, so this option is not available to me. But for Enterprise Edition, it is available. On automated patching, you can have critical updates, Windows security, Windows critical updates, and SQL Server critical updates automatically installed on your VM. And you can define a custom maintenance window here in which you would want those security updates to be installed on your machine. And whenever they are available, they will be installed on your virtual machine, on your SQL Server and Windows. Automated backups, you can come here and enable automated backups for your SQL Server. The retention period, max retention period right now is 30 days. You can pick a storage account where the backup file goes. You can encrypt the backups. You can also backup system databases. And you can have a custom backup schedule where you can come and configure the log backup schedule and the full backup schedule. And it can be weekly or daily, and different options are allowed here. So you can do that from here and change it and apply, and it takes place automatically. So you don't have to monitor it. You don't have to write scripts for it. All of this is done. Sorry, yeah.
Is the VM or SQL rebooted or restarted after patching?
The question is, after patching, is the SQL VM or SQL Server restarted? I'm not sure, Matt, do you know? Depends on the update, type of update.
If it requires
yeah.
a restart, it'll be restarted. But
Yeah.
if it doesn't require it, it wouldn't. But for
Yeah.
SQL, obviously, it's going to have to be restarted for sure. Not all Windows updates require that, but for SQL,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Can it do HA so that you just fail over to another node, do the patching on the passive, and then fail back, and then patch the other node? Or?
So the question is, can you do HA and configure it in a way that you fail over to another node, patch the primary, then fail back when the secondary is patched? If you have AGs configured on it, you can customize your maintenance schedule accordingly, that you don't bring both of them down together. So if one comes down for automated patches, like updates of patches, if it goes down, the other one will, high availability replica will automatically become primary. And and that one has a other schedule for updates, then when that goes down, this one will become primary. So.
Well, just to answer the question you had a little bit earlier about Azure Hybrid Benefit. So I will say in terms of the portal here, there's both checkboxes for Azure Hybrid Benefit for SQL and then Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server. That's just a trust model. So all you have to do is just check and say, hey, I have sufficient on-premises SQL and or Windows Server licenses with active software assurance. There's no blocker that'll prevent you from doing that. So in terms of whether or not you have to convert those from proc-based to core-based to ensure that you have enough licenses on-prem with SA to qualify for AHB, that's a good point. We can always follow up with via email to our business planning team. But I'd say in terms of mechanically, when you're in the Azure portal, there's no blocker for you to do so, as long as you have sufficient on-prem licenses with software assurance.
All right, some additional features, like you can enable machine learning services, SQL Server 2017 onwards on your virtual machine with the help of these features here. Now, all of these benefits you get only if you have registered with SQL VM Resource Provider. If you have self-installed, as in if you have your own media and if you have brought it to Azure and installed it on an Azure virtual machine, you won't see any of this unless you go and register with the resource provider. If, like I mentioned, if you have marketplace images installed, you get this by default. So you have this available to you today. You can see it on portal, and you can use all of these features. But if you have self-installed VMs, you will.
Question here?
Yeah, two questions. Why don't you show the build number on the overview screen? And then why can't you install CUs as part of automated patching, since you guys say you should proactively try to stay up to date on CUs, at least around premises?
So there's a lot of investment that we did in SQL virtual machine space, and this is what we started with. We'll do more investment, and all the investments that we do in future will come to resource provider. So right now, yes, we do not show the build number along with the SQL Server edition number there, but that is some feedback that we can take back to the engineering team and give them.
And he's right here. So.
And
but also the CUs, that's something we've also
Yes,
talked about for sure, Glenn.
CUs is
There's no
also
question.
some-
We've talked about that.
yeah. Yes.
The impact of the full version versus the lightweight version. Why would I ever use the lightweight version?
Why would I ever use, the question is, why would I ever use the lightweight version? So like I mentioned, when we talked about this to customers, some of the customers did not prefer restarting SQL Server. And then we came up with this lightweight version, which gives them some benefits of license flexibility. But for really giving them that automated patching and automated backups, we have to go and register the VM, the agent
So for
there.
licensing, you could use the lightweight one, right?
Yeah. Just if you need just license.
Is it all that all comes with the lightweight? Is just the licensing?
Yeah.
But yeah. So if you're just looking for the licensing part, you would use this lightweight piece. If you want this automation, you'd go to the full one.
Yeah. Any other question? Yeah.
If I built a virtual machine a year ago and I install SQL Server, can I still come and do the RP, or I have to build a new VM?
Very good question. No, you do not have to build a new VM. You can just register with the RP, and that will take care of giving you all of this.
That's exactly why we built it.
Yeah.
So that you could take existing VMs and get advantage of all this stuff.
And this is how you register with the RP, using this PowerShell command or
And that's all
CLI.
documented, right?
Yeah.
We have, and she showed the screen with all those options. That's all in our documentation how to do that.
That's in documentation, yes.
Okay.
Okay, all right. All right, so with that, I think I'm going to give it to you, Bob, for
Thanks, Shreya.
performance.
You can see a little bit why I thought Reimagined, because I didn't know any of this stuff. She was showing me these screens, and I'm like, hey, I kind of like these things. I like the fact that, especially the fact that you asked that question, because that was my first question. I'm like, I've used the marketplace images myself. I use them for testing all the time, quite frankly. But I know a lot of people, I don't even remember what the numbers are when I first saw it. A lot of people just install a VM and just bring their own SQL Server and install it there. And so we wanted you to have all those benefits, especially the licensing model, but we always loved the technology part of it as well. So that's a big reason why I think this whole idea is reimagined, is because we want you to feel like, if you think about it, you're managing the operating system, you're managing SQL Server, we're managing the hardware for you, but it's the cloud. I mean, can't we give you some assistance along the way? And so that's the whole idea of doing that. And I don't remember, Shreya, I didn't see all of the screens right there totally, but you covered some about storage configuration, some I think as well, right? So I do a lot of work with performance in SQL Server. And like I said, I started out in CSS working on performance cases for SQL Server Azure VM. So one of the things out of the gate that we worked on in the documentation was best practice guidance. And a lot of that guidance that we first pushed out there is the same today. Some of it's changed a little bit, but some of it's the same. Things like in that resource provider, there were things there to help you in guidance to do certain things, to get things right. That's another reason why you might take advantage of that, is to help you along that way. One of the things I wanted to point out, this is more of the reminder part I told you at the beginning of the talk, a reminder about best practices for performance. A lot of it comes down to storage, but consider that top line right there. Now, you may decide that you don't use lock pages today in Windows already with SQL Server. I do on every SQL Server I have. That still applies. Instant file initialization still applies. I had a customer one time had a backup problem, and it dealt with instant file initialization that they didn't have that set right. And then here's the one that I get all the time. I would get cases for customers to say, I've got a SQL Server performance problem in a VM, and it's not your fault. But they would totally forget their best practices for tuning SQL performance. It would be some rogue query running in the VM. They were convinced it was Azure. I'm like, I get that. But like, have you narrowed to a query? Oh yeah, this really terrible query running. And I said, does that same query run bad in the VM in your data center? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, well, sorry, but I don't necessarily know if we're going to make that run any better just because we're hosting the VM in Azure necessarily. So don't forget those kind of things. I spent a lot of time working and talking about Linux, and there's a specific set of Linux best practices that we call out, and those things apply both in a virtual machine in your data center or also in Azure. And then what's really interesting, if you've not seen this before, and Linux is kind of your thing, there's been some very specific enhancements to XFS file systems in Red Hat 8. It's actually upstream the Linux kernel, so other Linux distributions like Ubuntu and SLES are picking that up. And the interesting part of this optimization, you can see it in Azure Virtual Machine or your data center, is that Microsoft contributed to the open source that led to these changes to make I/O more performant with SQL Server on Linux. Take a look at this middle screen of these steps right here. It's all about Iops in many cases for SQL Server and for your workload. Does anybody know in this room how you would do number one? how would you start collecting peak Iops requirements for data log and tempdb? Just raise your hand if you think you know how to go do that. Glenn, how do you do that? Glenn, you do this a lot, right?
Yeah, I look at perfmon and then some of the DMV queries and get
Okay.
them back.
So you look at perfmon, and you look at DMV queries to figure out your I/O, right? Your I/Os per second with SQL Server. And I/Os come in the fact of that we're reading from files, we're writing to the transaction log, we're writing to the database file. So you need to do some baseline collections in your environment. If you're going to move to Azure VM, if you had to move from one VM in a data center to a hoster somewhere, you might have some of the same type of things to deal with, right? We're a hoster for you, for your virtual machine. So you need to take a look at IOPS going on in your environment. And by the way, I've had a lot of customers to do number one and found tuning that they need to do in their application just by doing this exercise, because they didn't realize how much I/O they were actually chewing up. So when you do that, we have a series of VM sizes for you. You may have seen all those out there that have certain IOPS limits that are documented and I/O requirements. You're going to go out there and try to pick the VM size that matches your needs. But guess what? One of the cool things I love about Azure is that you can dynamically change that, right? It may require a restart, but you can change VM sizes for your SQL Server workload if you didn't get this right. If your workload is tempdb heavy, you need to go to local SSDs. If you really have a very intensive tempdb workload, did you see me talk in my 19 talk about spills? Anybody in that talk? I talked about HashDB spills to tempdb. Well, if you can't predict when a spill is going to occur, wouldn't it be nice if tempdb is as fast as possible for that spill environment? The one thing I like about this number 3 statement is we've done work for you in the portal to help configure this so that if a failover occurs, that tempdb gets recreated correctly. If you don't do that from the configuration from our portal, there's some really known good documentation guidance on how to configure this the right way so that if your VM moves over, that local SSD is kind of refreshed in a new VM environment that handles that failover. Because early on in the days, that was a really difficult thing to do with SQL Server and Azure. So there's some other guidance here about disk striping and caching. We're going to talk about the caching in a second for read-only caching, which is a very interesting proposition for the Azure environment. Now notice number 6 says provision Ultra for disk only for log file. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second on benchmarking. It doesn't mean Ultra can't work for other workloads, but it works best in scenarios where you have really heavy log operations, and we'll talk about that. So again, you're going to go through this process of monitoring IOPS in your environment. And again, if you don't know how to do that, literally look for people like Glenn, because I've seen Glenn post about these kind of type things. There are experts in the community that talk about how do you go monitor these things in your environment, and then you pick the right VM size that meets those needs. Because by the way, if you don't pick the right size and you under-provision the VM size, you're going to get what? You're going to get throttled. It's kind of like having a disk SAN system in your environment that can't handle your I/O workload. So we want you to get it right and make sure you're using these best practices. That's not necessarily reimagined. It's a reminder of that these base things need to get done, but some of the things we're doing in the resource provider in the portal are going to help guide you through this. And IOPS testing, again, being that key. So along the way of doing SQL VM Reimagination, the team this summer spent a lot of time thinking about performance with benchmarking. Not necessarily an official benchmark post. How many of you in the room are familiar with TPC, E, and C? Would you say? Glenn's like, yes, I do that all the time. A lot of people I talk to are like, that looks like letters in a Star Trek Enterprise thing, right? Star Trek Enterprise, D, you know, they have letters for the Enterprise. It gets killed in a show, and then another Enterprise comes along, and you get a new letter, right? So let me just make sure you understand and unpack these two benchmarks so we were just very clear how this works. TPC-C is an older benchmark for OLTP. The reason it's older, by the way, it's very write intensive, is people that started seeing the benchmark said, no one has an app that looks like this. So therefore, that's not going to become our standard benchmark. We're going to use E instead, which is a more balanced read-write workload. Now you got to pick some benchmark to do, and your workload could look somewhere like E or somewhere like C, but E is the one that's industry standard. So we went along and did some testing with E to make some observations. First of all, we noticed that in E, which has read workloads inside of it, that Azure Blob Cache is a key part of making it fast. Because guess what? Azure Blob has free read cache just by using Azure Blob. And that makes read performance really fast in this scenario. It can make analysis type TPCH workloads fast as well, but it's super fast when it comes to running E-type workloads. And as it turns out, if you look at our best practice guidance, we will tell you for a data disk to turn on that read cache. We don't do that for a log disk for write caching. We don't do that for durability reasons. But for read caching, it accelerates a workload, and even a workload like OLTP. And you're going to find out that Azure Read Blob Cache is specific to Azure Cloud. That's one of the benefits of using the Azure Cloud. And you don't pay extra for it. You just use Azure Blob. Now, improve application throughput happens by adding capacity. So this first demo example of some of these numbers, what happened in our testing we found out is we were throttled on Iops. So what we did is we just added more disk and got more Iops and capacity and accelerated our performance. It's a good example of looking at Iops and capacity, running your workload and saying, oh, I'm getting throttled a little bit. I just simply need to add some more storage, because guess what? As I add more storage, I'm going to get more Iops capacity of my workload. Now, you're going to have some workloads that need very or high sensitive to latencies, which is typically the log, typically the transaction log, and that's where Ultra can come into play. So in our testing workloads, the good news for you is, and Ultra is a great technology, but some people think it's pretty expensive. So we really feel that premium storage can serve the needs of a lot of your workloads, and we kind of proved it with this blog post we did showing TPC-E-derived workloads that we did. Again, not an official benchmark, because an official benchmark has a big approval process you go through, but it is very much the same workload you would run in an official benchmark, and we've got the numbers that we post in this blog post to show we think it's all possible. Now, what we did is we also did a demonstration. How many of you in the room here, besides Glenn, so I'm going to call Glenn out because he knows all this stuff, how many in the room here has run HammerDB before? A few folks. When you're running HammerDB, that open source tool uses a TPC-C-like workload. It doesn't offer an E version of it, okay? But we were out to kind of prove a few things to ourselves. We're like, can we use HammerDB so our customers could do it themselves? Couldn't we use this, and we just kind of click this demo here. Can we use it to prove the fact that we could do something, you know, you just like to find round numbers. Like, can we do 1 million? How hard would we do 1 million? Using some of those measurements I showed in the previous slide. So this is a recording showing us running what's called a ramp test. Very few people run applications that start with 1,000 users right out of the gate. It's usually a ramp up. A certain number of users, and it just goes up even exponentially. So we're configuring HammerDB to go do a ramp up test. And on the right-hand side, you're going to see a graph that shows you batch requests per second, which is kind of a throughput counter, right? And a disk throughput per second at the top. And as you go along and look at this ramp, you can see what happens in this video. This just starts getting better and bigger and bigger. As you scale up, and you see on the right-hand side, the parts where the graph stops is the ramp-up time, right? So I had these number of users, I kind of paused, and then I got a bunch more users kicking in. And as more users kick in, the throughput just keeps getting higher and higher. It doesn't get throttled. And at the very end of this whole run here, we're like, is this even possible? Does a final number even matter to a customer? Can you get to where you need to be? And sure enough, we got to about almost 2 million. Now, what that means to you is that if you want to go out and see whether Azure VM performs to a workload that you need, this is the maximum write type workload you would test. You're not even going to probably need that. And we show you in the blog post how you can configure for that kind of workload to almost get 2 million transactions per minute. So the reason I wanted to call that out is to make sure you understand how benchmarking kind of works in general, and how you have an open source tool available to you to go test and see how far can I push SQL Server to Azure VM to meet the needs of my workload. Okay. So one last thing you might find interesting, that's Microsoft doing that. And you're like, okay, Microsoft, you did that test, that's interesting. I'll try HammerDB. But has anybody else tried this thing? So you may see in the Rohan keynote that a company called GigaOM did an independent study of trying to compare how well does SQL Server run on Azure versus Amazon. And you see 2 graphs here. One is called performance, one is called price performance. Now what I love about this is that we're just announcing that the study results have come out from this company. And you're going to see pretty soon the actual full paper where they've released their entire results with all the details that you can scrutinize and ask all sorts of questions about. The key points here, you just see the fact that how faster it is, but also about the price perf. And that has a lot to do with that Azure hybrid benefit we're talking about. And not just that, but also for the free read blob cache storage we mentioned, okay? Since the fact that we have read-only blob cache that you just get because you're using Azure Blob Storage, it really makes a huge difference when it comes to price performance. So look for that study coming out further soon with all the details behind how they, as an independent company, came out with these numbers. Okay, so that was performance, and I care deeply about that. Quick reminder, though. Couple things. One is you can push it as far as you want using these open source tools, right? Don't forget about the best practices. Especially don't forget about your SQL tuning, because you're going to look at these workloads, you're going to run them and think, I got an Azure problem. And it might be that you do, but please make sure you still do your standard practices. I think there's a question in the back there. Yeah?
So I thought one of the new features of SQL 2019 is automatic tuning.
One of the new features of SQL 19 is automatic tuning. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. Are you thinking about auto plan correction? That was SQL 17, but yeah, it's in SQL 19 too.
So would that require, how much effort would that require from me if I have to utilize that feature?
Yeah, the question is, like, how much effort does that require? Here's the great news for you. There's no difference in using that feature in Azure Virtual Machine as just on your laptop or in your own data center. That is you turning on a feature for Query Store, okay, in your environment. We start making recommendations for plan correction problems, and then you flip a switch and say, you guys fix it yourself. So, and what Shreya talked about, this is SQL Server that you control here. So that same method that you control that in Azure VM as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So zero effort.
What she said. Zero effort. I do want to point out, though, that you don't typically turn on the automatic part first. I recommend people turn on Query Store and get the recommendations, and then you go to auto at that point if you want to. Yeah.
So the VM that the tests were running on appeared to be 64 cores and just north of 400 gigs of RAM.
Yep, that's about right.
How large of an instance can you build out in Azure?
Gosh, I have to go look at the VM sizes lately. I can't keep track of them. Does anybody know, do you know, Shreya, the largest VM sizes we support?
The M series are, I think, the largest, and I think they have, what, 128 cores?
I
Pretty
promise
big
you,
on Series V2, yeah.
every time I look at that answer, there's a new one. I'm really being serious, because
Yeah.
I try to go push it as far as I can as well. So it's pretty big these days, to be quite frankly. Terabytes of storage and certainly large amounts of RAM, but I don't remember the exact sizes. M is about as big as you get today.
Yeah.
So I'm telling you, it's bigger than you think. Let's put it that way. Okay, other questions before I talk about high availability? Because you're going to enjoy this part. Do you have another comment?
We are also letting you create dedicated hosts now in Azure and install RP, Sql Vmrp on it.
Oh, that's nice.
So you can create very big machine as long as you can pay for it.
By the way, that team, Kevin, I'm wrong here, but that team that talks, I mean, they look at us as a major workload running in this space right here. So they're going to start making sure, they want to make sure that they provide compute sizes and things big enough to handle workloads like SQL Server. Yeah, there's a question here.
Any performance or price comparison data with Google Cloud?
So the question is there any price performance between SQL Server, Azure, and Google Cloud? And Matt, do you want to make
so
a
the
quick comment?
the GigaOM study for SQL DB and SQL IaaS just looked at AWS and Azure, which are really kind of what we've seen are kind of the two dominant in terms of market share. I know for SQL DW there was an analysis done that also showed versus say Google as well, but I think those two were specifically versus Azure and AWS. Yeah. Okay.
Let me go to him back here first, and we'll come to you. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Can you stand up and talk until we get the mic to you really loudly?
Resource provider, new resource provider, is that similar to, I guess, the technology that's used in the managed instance? The Azure managed instance, is that the same technology? But basically, we actually turn it on or set it up in the resource provider. Is that the same technology?
So the question is resource provider and managed instance same technology? No, they are not. Managed instance is fully managed service. So you bring your SQL Server and your data workload in cloud, and we manage it for you completely. This one, you get some features for automated manageability, but rest of it pretty much you have to set up on your own.
But what I like, Shreya, is that we're starting down that path a little bit, right?
Yes.
So if you saw what she did there, it's not necessarily the same technology, but the same capability. Like, can we, again, remember I told you earlier, we're trying to build an Azure virtual machine that you manage, but then we assist you in a certain area. That's the whole reason for doing some of that. Is that kind of what you're after? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the way things were a year or two ago is you had self-installations of SQL and Azure VMs, very limited features. Our Azure Marketplace images that had some additional HA and backup capabilities, auto patching, and then PaaS managed instance had the most. And like Bob said, we're doing two things. So first, we're bringing the self-installations of SQL and Azure VMs. We're bringing those up to par with the Azure Marketplace images as long as you register with the resource provider. So those self-installs are on the same page with the Azure Marketplace as long as you have the resource provider. And then the IaaS, either self-install or Marketplace, we're bringing those to be really IaaS++ is what we talk about it internally.
Is that gonna hit the Twitter? Hashtag IaaS++. I like that. There you go, man.
But yeah,
like a programmer, man.
Exactly.
I like that. Yeah,
exactly. So a lot of those advanced data security, for example, those are things that used to be PaaS only, and now we're bringing those.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that. We're gonna talk about security.
IaaS.
There was one other question, and I want to move forward with high availability, if that's okay. Yeah.
I just had a question when you mentioned something about dedicated host.
Yeah.
Is that a dedicated host, is that a dedicated physical machine that's not a VM anymore, or is it a dedicated host as in a VM host server that may have positive licensing benefits to being able to host many VMs on that like we do on-premise?
It's a dedicated machine, but you create a VM on it.
Okay.
So you can have multiple VMs created on that machine.
But it's your machine.
But it's your
effectively.
machine,
Okay.
yes.
So along those lines, we currently use the licensing model for SQL Server where we license it at the VM host level, and that's a benefit because then we don't pay for it per VM. Would that same benefit apply if we did something like that with dedicated hosts in Azure?
Yeah, I think Matt will answer.
Exactly. So yeah, from a long story short is yes. So unlimited virtualization. You have that on premises with the Enterprise Edition with software assurance. Same thing in Azure Dedicated Host too.
We view that as a potential, not so much a barrier, but a cost bump.
Okay.
If we didn't have that, and now that it is there, that may make that more appealable to us.
Awesome.
Oh, that's awesome.
All right, let's talk about high availability a little bit. We talked about performance. These technologies that you use today with SQL Server absolutely still apply with Azure, within Azure. And we're going to talk a little bit of how always-on availability groups has a new interesting twist from a licensing perspective when you go hybrid. So has anybody ever tried to do an availability group deployment in Azure Virtual Machine in just Azure Virtual Machine? So would you like to have a drink later, or? Sorry, just kidding. Sorry, Dinesh. We're not trying to, I'm sorry. No, I've done it too, right? And we do provide something for you. I'm not saying we don't have anything. We have a CLI to help automate things. We have ARM templates, right, that we provide. But one of the reasons we asked Dinesh to come today was literally to get your feedback. Because what we'd like, see, it says planned portal automation. We would love to build in technology like she showed with the resource provider, that kind of type environment to assist with this. So it'd be really interesting to know, to take a few minutes and ask, what do you need? Like, what would you like us to do to make this a great experience? You didn't know you're gonna ask for questions. Look right over here. Everybody's starting to raise their hand, Matt. Here we go. Get ready, Dinesh. Here we go. You taking notes? Here we go.
All right, so when Managed Instance first released, you had to build out all of the networking backend, and that is now included. Could there be something similar for Azure AGs where, kind of the network backend, the clustering, all of that stuff gets built out just by clicking a button?
Okay. He didn't bring his laptop. He's going to start coding, but so.
Feedback taken.
Yeah, whoever. Yeah, just go ahead.
I'd like to just enter the server name, the availability group name, the cluster, or I don't even care about the cluster name, and the listener name, and it build it for me automatically.
You probably want to tell us how many replicas and that kind of stuff, right?
Right,
Do I need DR?
Enter the
Do I need those
number,
kind of things? Okay.
Enter the number.
Okay,
yeah.
you just want to simplify the whole experience. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Did you want to create your own VMs, or you wanted us to
Yeah,
take
do you want us to
care
create that's a good question. You want us to create the VMs along with it?
I don't mind you doing that.
You don't mind that? It'd be great if you could just throw in the VMs with it. I got it. Go ahead.
For me, it's important to know that the load balancer can be, using template for quick configuration, because that's my part. I need to switch from, previous DBA, set up the basic load balancer, but now I need to change it to a standard load balancer.
Okay.
I'm gonna have some difficult time trying to switch over.
Do you need some choices there, though? I mean, is it one of those things where, like, just put a load balancer out there for me, or you need a few options on how you do load balancing?
I think if you can have a template to help DBAs configure standard load balancer across regions, that would be great.
Yeah, that's the one thing I was interested was, do you want like, hey, I'd love to do just a single region scenario and then help me automate the cross-region scenario?
A cross region would be best.
Interesting.
Okay.
Okay. So back over here, let's take a few more designing on the fly at Past Summit. I like it.
Azure load balancers, can we have more than one? And I have had issues with some latency when I try to access the database from the client using the listener and going
Straight to the cluster node. Those are the two questions. Can we have more than one Azure load balancer? And can we improve the latency between the client, the load balancer, and the actual SQL Server node?
Okay, so I think you can use only one load balancer today, and yeah, we will look at providing more than one. And regarding the latency between listener and load balancer and SQL Server.
This is from your client on premise, by the way? Is the client on premise? All in the cloud. Okay, all in the cloud. Okay. All Azure. You've just noticed you've had general problems with that
I see.
overall.
Okay.
Okay.
It's just a feedback.
Okay. Okay. So would it help you to have some diagnostics to figure that out? First of all, you'd like it just to work, and I think it does work pretty well. So it'd be interesting to know, like later on afterwards, your scenario, because I don't think everyone is running just because they can figure that way, running into latencies. But having some diagnostics to figure out where the problem is might be nice. One other, we'll go here and then we'll go here. Yeah.
So I do have a situation. I have a problem. Applications in the DMZ, and so trying to configure my applications in the DMZ to connect to my always-on availability groups. And
DMZ?
Yeah.
Okay. So helping that scenario better?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. All right. So sometimes I wonder, and I love the feedback, sometimes I wonder if some of it could be guidance, like we may not be able to automate it, but it sure would be nice to have some specific steps about how to make that successful, right?
Yeah.
Because that's one thing we can always do is say, hey, what are we not documenting right for you, right? So Ben, yeah.
Yeah, so I'd like to see some extra love for PowerShell too on this. The CLI is great, but to make it less painful to do that in PowerShell as well would be great. You have a lot of modules.
PowerShell example.
Yeah.
Are you guys okay with GitHub and stuff like that?
You can, yeah, I think so.
Does
You
people
can
are
do things
generally
with
okay
templates,
with GitHub
but
examples? I love GitHub because it allows you to fork it and
Yep.
give suggestions easily. Okay.
it'd be great.
Okay. One right here. We'll take a couple more, and then we'll move on to some other topics. Thanks for all this feedback. This is what we're hoping for. We literally sat this morning and said, we're going to make this a feedback session, right? Go ahead.
So for the on-prem AZ configuration, we didn't have to use a load balancer, but for Azure, we have to. Is there any way to avoid that in future?
No, unfortunately not. I mean, in Azure, you have to use load balancer. Otherwise, there is no way for us to assign you the IP.
I mean, trying to give you external networking capability into our network, it's the only way to do it today. But does that cause you problems? Or if we helped automate that, though, if we help make that better, I mean, does that cause you problems? Or?
Tons of problems, right? So these are two additional components that I need to worry about now.
Okay.
I have about like 100 production SQL servers where I need to configure this. It's a constant battle with networking and system engineering, where they have to configure these load balancers. Make sure that they, again, if you configure manually one load balancer in the portal, you're going through at least 10, 15 configuration steps, right?
But so one thing
It's
is
a
to
lot
help
of
the
extra.
configuration of a lot of SQL servers with load balancers. That's one thing you said, right?
Yeah.
But what was the other part that is just an extra layer of things you have to debug or diagnose?
So in this picture, right, you're talking about two load balancers, right? Two extra components in the architecture compared to my on-prem. So if you add more number of SQL servers, it all adds up, right? It's a more hassle.
Okay.
So there is Windows came up with a technology called dynamic network names, which will actually eliminate the need of load balancers in Azure. We are testing it. We don't know whether that will work well with SQL yet, but if that works,
but just the pain of load balance, if that works, that'd be great. But in general, the pain of load balancers overall, configuring one thing, but two, just having to deal with all of them is another one. Is that correct?
That's right. It's more add-ons and more risk,
Yeah.
right? So to environments, that's all. Yep.
So we are certainly looking into that area, but I don't have anything to share.
Let's take, if you could, one here and then one there, and then we'll move on, and then afterwards we'll just stay right here and you can give us more.
This is hot
And we
topic.
have, and remember, we're going to put that alias back up at the end. If you didn't get your feedback in after this session here, we're going to want you to send email to that alias. I think, who was it right here? Just right here.
Yeah, can you explain a bit what's a load balancer, CLI, quick start, template?
Oh, you mean back on that screen, this screen, like what is this stuff right here? You want to take that one, Shreya? These two?
Okay, so these are just Azure command line interface. So these are just Azure command line commands that will let you set up your AG. It automates some part of it. An ARM template is Azure Resource Manager. So if you are in portal, it will give you some templates which will let you set up, which will let you provide some parameters and let you automate your scripts.
It's kind of like the first generation of helping you automate. And then if you see that note about planned, Dinesh is here, a developer and a team. We'd like to make that more graphical and make it even more automatable. Like you talked about over here, click a button and this thing works.
They're
One-
just APIs or commands.
So if you don't mind, one right here, and then if you would, we'll at the, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, can you guys, I can't hear this question real quick. Yeah, can you?
Having choice between VMs and containers to deploy an AG.
The question is that what, you want to know which one?
I would like to have the choice.
I understand. Okay, I can take that one.
Yes.
So yeah, this is everything we're talking about right now is doing always on availability groups in a virtual machine. Everything we're talking about today. As it turns out, you could technically do an AG with containers in say Linux VMs, and you're not going to get this automation at least today. What you're going to go for is Kubernetes. That's what you want, and we offer automated AGs in our big data cluster solutions, and where we're headed is automated AGs just in Kubernetes. So when you do that, you're going to deploy something like Azure Kubernetes Service to do almost what this is doing right here, but do it in an Azure Kubernetes Service, not in a VM scenario. And that's what we're trying to go for, from a container perspective. Hey, thanks for that. That was kind of fun. Dinesh, what do you think? Did you get some feedback? And Shreya took a ton of notes as we're, so that Dinesh should have to memorize every single thing we were doing. So.
I'll make sure he delivers.
Okay, all right. So hey, one last thing is about failover cluster instance and premium file share. So Storage Spaces Direct has been the primary mechanism you've been using for that technology in Azure. And we just announced the support for premium file share. Premium file share being a really cool option for you and still very performant for you for doing a failover cluster instance in Azure. Some of this stuff's pretty interesting. Look at number 2 right there, resize capacity with 0 downtime. And this is actually a true statement. So you're going to build one of these file shares, put your shared storage databases on this thing, right? And they're going to go like, I don't have enough space. I don't want to take all this down. You can resize up and down this with no downtime, all managed by Azure. The other thing that's interesting, it's very attractive here, is you can lower the amount of storage and sizes required for the VMs now by using the file share service itself for the shared storage part. And then the burstable part is very interesting. You actually fix the sizes of these to a certain size, and if you don't use it, all of it, we kind of give you credit for that. And then if you burst over your limit, we give it to you for free for that burst scenario. So do you see how it's very expandable and flexible for how it's used? And the fact that it's also redundant across zones, availability zones, which could be across regions. This could be the new way to do a failover cluster instance in Azure. I want to highly encourage you to take a look at it. We just announced support for this over the last month. And there's a whole tutorial about how you might configure this using failover cluster instance. And so this is an interesting one. This could generate a ton of feedback, and we'll run out of time, I think, if we try to go deep into this. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you kind of a pitch of what we've offered now. This is independent of a SQL Server version. And then when we're done after the talk, I'd like you to come up and see if you have more questions about it. Before today, in our licensing rules, if you wanted a secondary replica for, say, an AG in Azure to be just for DR purposes, in other words, you're not reading from it, it's just there available in case I have to manually failover to it, you had to pay for licenses for that thing just to sit there and do nothing, okay? No longer. It's now for free. You don't pay for licenses for a DR in Azure VM as a DR replica for your availability group on-premise anymore. That's incredible. So that's a very, very popular thing we've noticed. The word passive, by the way, just means that. It just sits there taking your changes, awaiting for you, if you have a DR moment, to flip over this thing and need it for DR purposes. You can, by the way, you can back up from it and do things like CheckDB. You just, from a licensing perspective, can't read from it as a replica. So it's a new benefit for software assurance. We just announced this past week. It's not tied to SQL 19. It's independent of any SQL Server version, but a really, really great benefit and exclusive to Azure Virtual Machine. Is that right, Matt? Exclusive to using Azure, Azure DR replica. Okay, so last thing, talk about security. You saw a lot of discussions this week already about Azure SQL and the benefits of platform as a service. And you saw Shreya talk about resource providers and the benefit to that, right? Again, you asked a really good question earlier, like, I'm not still getting all this. I mean, is this managed instance or what is this thing, right? Remember now, let's be very clear here. You still own and control the operating system and SQL Server fully. We just control, obviously, and we help you manage the hardware and all those resources. But we're trying to move you more towards the managed instance experience by giving you more automations to assist you. But what we don't want to do is ever make you think you can't control the OS and SQL Server fully in that environment. Now, some people have told us, we kind of like the things you're doing in the security space. Things like threat detection. Wouldn't it be cool if in these virtual machines, you could detect threats like you've done in Azure SQL? Like I've got a suspicious attacker going inside SQL Server in my machine. We're like, yeah, that's kind of neat. I agree with you. Well, can you do it in Azure VM as well? And now it turns out we have a preview that you can. So we offer now in public preview. I think it's public. I believe it's public preview now.
It is public.
Yeah, you can do threat detection logic. You can use the same services that we're doing in the cloud today to detect, and this is really interesting stuff, because you can detect, for example, you can detect if somebody is trying to go ping your SQL server and hack your SA account, something like that. So stuff that's really, really powerful that you might see only in Azure SQL now offered, and that also includes vulnerability assessments as well. So we'll be able to run services, and we're using OMS to do this, that we normally run in Azure SQL to detect possible vulnerability problems with the configuration of your SQL server, like, for example, you have SA still enabled, or everything's DBO, or something of that nature that is the best practices for security. And then there's a central dashboard now because of this for across your VM databases. Now this is really nice because we're again using the power of the cloud. Because you've registered things for us, we can look across these virtual machines for all these SQL servers and give you dashboards now for these vulnerability assessments to say, because you said earlier, I had 100 SQL servers I'm trying to use this environment. Wouldn't it be nice to have a central place to find out vulnerabilities across my enterprise in that way? So that's a little bit of what we're doing in the space of performance, availability, and security. Again, reimagining the fact that we would love to work in this space if this is what you need from an IaaS perspective, and us providing more things that are cloud-powered to assist you along the way. So I think it'd be great if we kind of finish off, Shreya, with talking about new service for backups, and you kind of explain what we're doing in that space.
Right. Thank you, Bob. All right, so there are 3 ways in which you can back up your SQL Server on Azure SQL VM today. The first one is automated backup that basically uses the managed backup technology underneath. And I showed you how you can do that using Sql Vmrp. On the portal, you can configure automated backups. You can have a custom window in which you want to start the backup. You can do full backups, log backups, everything. And this supports up to 12 terabytes of backup. So this is compressed backup, by the way. So if you might have a bigger file on disk, but the backup will be, after compression, will be 12 terabytes. So automated backup support up to 12 terabyte of backups. If you have backups beyond that, beyond 12 terabyte, larger than that, then or VLDB backups, then we suggest customers using file snapshot backup today. So that is another method that you can use. Yes?
Are we talking about a proprietary Azure backup, or is this like a native SQL backup, or what is the actual end product?
So the question is, are we talking about native SQL backups or a different backup product? So both automated backups and file snapshot backups are native SQL technology. Like I mentioned, automated backups uses managed backups behind the scene. So they are both SQL, native SQL technology. You are not paying for anything else.
So we'll have to configure it to a certain storage location, like blob storage or something like that.
The question is, do I have to configure automated backups to a certain storage location, maybe blob storage? And yes, that's right. So you need to have a blob storage account, and then the space that you will be using in blob storage will be shared.
We just have access to it just like if we do backups.
Yes. So the question is, can we have access just like we did the backups? Yes, and you can restore from that too. Yes.
Are we talking the operating system and everything, or are we talking like OLS backups?
The question is it only SQL Server backup or operating system backup too? This is only SQL Server backup with automated backups and file snapshot backup. There was a question here.
Who controls the schedules?
So the question is, who controls the schedules? So if you have resource provider, you have registered with resource provider, you can go on portal and control the schedule for backups the way you want. You can configure it there. So you control it. The storage cost, is it additional or built in already? It's additional. So one last question, all right. Who backs up the system databases? This provides you a way to back up system databases, right, Matt? Yeah, so you can back up the system database using this. Yes?
Building on the gentleman's question, are there ways of doing backups of either the whole VM or a C drive or something so that you have
That's a great question. The question is, are there ways of doing backup of the entire VM along with the OS and C drive and everything? So that's the next point, Azure Backup, and I'll come to that next.
Checks in the mail. Just transition to the next question, next slide.
All right, so with that question, let me move on to Azure Backup, and then we can take the questions at the end. So the third way you can back up your SQL Server is using Azure Backup Service. It's a different separate service in Azure available to you, which can back up your SQL Server, your VM, and other data services as well. They support a few services in Azure that they can back up today. And what I'm going to do is, okay, let me explain Azure Backup real quick. So what this does is basically you have a VM with SQL Server running on it, and it creates a recovery service vault. They call it recovery service vault. It's basically nothing but your storage account plus some management service on top of it, and they name it recovery service vault. And what they do is when you register with them or install Azure Backup Service or subscribe to Azure Backup Service, they put a small plugin on your VM. It's Azure Backup plugin for SQL. They put a small plugin there, which will actually talk to your SQL Server, take the backups, put them on recovery service vault, which is nothing but a storage account, and then will let you restore from those backups. They provide beautiful services like point-in-time restore and differential backup, full backup. Everything is supported. So it's a great way to back up your SQL Server. If you're multiple, they provide a portal dashboard also, so you can do multiple backups at the same time. All right, and it has auto protection, intelligent restores, long-term retention. Up to years. They support multiple years of long-term retention. So today with automated backups, you get only 30 days of retention, and this is a solution if you want longer-term retention. They support 2008 and 2008 R2 as well, and they have support for 2019 and Windows Server 2019, SQL Server 2019 and Windows Server 2019 as well. And they recently announced support for taking backup as a .back file, and you can actually take this .back file to on-prem and restore it there, or you can restore it to another VM. So that is also.
So really, this is kind of like a new service. It's a VDI stream-based type technology going to this special storage area, but then you can actually see just like backup files and use them.
Exactly.
Yeah, nice.
Exactly. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a demo real quick from them, which I got from them actually, and we'll just talk through that quickly. And so you just have to start with locating your recovery services vault first. And once you have the recovery services vault, you can click on that backup tab there to start a backup. And it starts with actually finding out your resources, your SQL VMs. So you start discovering the VMs, and you select the VMs that you want to start backup on, SQL Server backup on. Once you have selected the VMs, it will actually go and install that plugin on those VMs. And once the plugin is installed, you can start configuring your backups. So you can see that all these databases are available on those VMs which we selected to start backup on. And if you expand on these databases here, you will see on these instances, basically, you will see all the databases that are part of these instances. So you can individually select one database, or you can select all of them. And they have a feature called Auto Protect. If that Auto Protect feature is on, it will automatically detect any new databases created on this VM in future, and it will back it up automatically for you. So you don't have to come back and configure backup for the new databases also. So Auto Protect is actually really useful feature for this. And so this way you just configure the backup, you go back, you define a backup policy. And in this policy, you can have full backups, differential backups, or log backups. You can configure all of these, the time, schedule, whatever time you want, and the schedule that you want the backups to happen. And once you have enabled this and you have defined all the policy here, you can, like I mentioned, for log backup also there's a policy, you can define that. You just enable it. Once you have enabled it, it creates a job, and you can go back to the portal, look at the backup jobs, and it gives you a list of all the backups that are in progress or that have happened, that have completed, that have failed, and it's a single unified dashboard for all of your backup resources that you can come here, monitor, and look at the health of it. Then for recovery, you identify your VM, and you look at all the backups that have happened on that VM. You pick any healthy backup that has happened in the past to which you want to recover to. And either you can overwrite to an existing database. If you think it is corrupted and you want to overwrite to that, you can do that, or you can pick an alternate location where you want to restore this database. And then restoring, you can do a full and differential restore manually using a full backup and differential backup files that you have. Or you can restore to a point in time, and they provide a very good dashboard here where you can just click on a point in time and then restore to that point in time. And here in this demo, they're actually going to restore to 6:05 a.m. And then the system automatically identifies the full and differential backups that it will need to restore to that point in time, and then they will restore it. So this Azure Backup Service works on both, like I mentioned before, on both SQL Server, and it backs up Azure VM resources also.
And it's all the way back from 2008. So it's not like you have to have 19 to use this, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
It's all the way back from 2008. Yeah. So with that, I think we are at the end. Here are some session resources.
Let's do this. So thank you so much for everything, Shreya. This is amazing stuff. I think you can see why we kind of think we reimagined a few things here in this kind of space. What I'd like to do is, if you need to leave, that's great. The four of us will all be down here up front to answer all your questions if you want to stay and take questions. Please give us the feedback if you need to. Shreya, can you put that email address back up at the very beginning? Because I know you're probably saying to yourself, I had a question, but I got to leave. So we want to definitely encourage you. I'll put that deck again up there on AKMS. I'll do that after the event's over. But if you have questions that you didn't get answered and you have to leave, certainly use that email address. Thank you so much for your patience and your time today. We hope you enjoyed your session. Thank you.